All right, everybody, we're back. Gavel's falling apart here. We have our personnel briefing to start with our analyst, Jason Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jason Kramer with the Department of Legislative Services, and I'll be presenting the analysis for the Department of Budget and Management Office of Personnel Services and Benefits. I'll discuss the ongoing issue of vacant positions in state government, statewide salary actions, and the state's health insurance plan, including the planned transition of retiree prescription drug coverage to Medicare Part D. Starting here on page 1, the allowance is $542 million. Most of the funds in fiscal 2024 and 2025 that you see here will be transferred out of the agency to support state agency salary increases. I'd also note that the fiscal 2024 amount reflects a $30 million general fund reversion due to expected vacancy savings across state agencies. Jumping next to page 5 and the one managing for results item I'll discuss. Exhibit 1 here shows state prescription plan spending by drug category. Diabetes is a big driver of both healthcare and prescription costs for the state plan. And anti-diabetic drugs have been the largest share of prescription drug costs for some time in the state plan. Since fiscal 2020, those costs have grown from $14.5 million per quarter to $29.3 million per quarter. In addition, the number of users of anti-diabetic drugs has increased by 31% across that same time period. DLS is asking DBM to comment on the rising cost of these medications. Moving ahead to page 8, Exhibit 3. Exhibit 3 shows the spending by purpose in the statewide program of the DBM budget. Funding is provided for a 3% general salary increase and regular increments for state employees. Funding is also provided for an additional increment for employees who have been with the state since June 30th of 2019. Funding is also provided for the annual salary review. That amount is $24.6 million, as well as cost of living adjustment and bonuses for members of SLEOLA, as well as bonuses for public safety employees with regards to recruitment and retention. The statewide program also includes funding for fringe benefits, including $74.2 million for the retirement reinvestment contribution. In prior years, this funding was built into the contribution rates in each agency's personnel budgets. However, this year it's in the statewide program in DBM's budget. Statute mandates a $75 million supplemental contribution. It's a little bit lower in the budget due to non-budgeted funds. DLS is recommending a BRFA action that would reduce that mandated amount to $50 million and also recommending a reduction of $21.6 million in general funds related to this lower contribution. At the same time, that BRFA provision, the recommended BRFA provision, would repeal a requirement to reduce the pension contribution by the amount of administrative fees for local school boards. The statewide program here, still on page 8, also recognizes a couple of projected cost savings. $50 million in anticipated savings is expected due to the transition of retiree prescription drug coverage to Medicare Part D. This is a half year's worth of savings as the change goes into effect January 1st, 2025. DBM is also cutting the unemployment insurance rate in half and recognizing $6 million in savings here. Moving on to page 12, Exhibit 5. This exhibit shows the proposed changes in the fiscal 2025 allowance. Most of these items are discussed elsewhere in the analysis. One item that is not funded in DBM's budget is the employer contribution to the family program. That's due to legislation to delay implementation. And so DLS is just asking DBM to comment on the state's plans to fund the benefit for employees going forward. Page 14, personnel data. DBM proposes adding 2.4 new positions in their allowance for OPSB, one of which is a director level position focusing on professional development and training. DLS is proposing a $36,000 reduction to reflect a 25% turnover rate for this new position. To the first of 3 issues I'll discuss, beginning on page 15, I'll discuss the issue of state vacancies in state agencies. The fiscal 2025 allowance, as you can see here, includes 2,452 new positions in executive branch agencies, excluding higher education. Of these, nearly 1,200 are contractual conversions, and most of those are in the Department of Health. Appendix E in the governor's budget books reflects nearly 400 contractual conversions that are not included in the individual agency pages, or in data provided to DLS. And DLS is recommending annual language that would add a requirement that data be consistent throughout all materials. On page 17, Exhibit 7 shows the number of vacancies across state government. Since peaking at nearly 6,500 executive branch vacancies in October of 2022, the number of vacant positions has fallen dramatically to just under 4,900 vacancies in January of this year, as shown here in this exhibit. This improvement is actually somewhat understated, as several hundred new positions were added beginning in July of 2023. The current period is the first sustained reduction in vacancies that's not due to abolishing vacant positions since at least 2008. While improvements are clearly being made and the trends are positive, the vacancy rate remains at 10%, which is historically high and much higher than the budgeted 7.8% turnover rate in the fiscal 2025 allowance. So DLS is recommending reducing funding by $40 million for statewide salaries to reflect likely vacancy savings and a budgeted turnover rate of 8.6%. Page 18, Exhibit 8, a primary strategy to improve recruitment and retention in state agencies is salary increases. This exhibit shows the recent increases in state salaries. For most state employees, those increases have been nearly 33% since fiscal 2019. On page 19, Exhibit 9, as I mentioned earlier, there's $24.6 million provided for annual salary reviews. That's a little bit less than in fiscal 2024, but higher than in all prior fiscal years. As you may remember, the budget committees last year requested that DBM commission a salary study to evaluate state compensation levels. PRM Consulting compared state salaries to local jurisdictions, the federal government, the MedStar hospital system, and the University of Maryland, which has independent personnel authority. The study found a well-designed but complex salary structure with 32 different salary scales. Overall, the report found that salary scale midpoints are about 4.6% below peers, but the standard scale, which most employees are on, is 8.8% below its peers. On page 20, the report made several recommendations regarding employee compensation. These included increasing the salaries on the standard scale by 8.5% and the correctional officer scale by 6%. As noted earlier, the budget includes $45.9 million for an additional increment for longer serving employees. In order to more closely align with the salary study's recommendation, DLS is recommending adding language to the budget that would restrict that funding to instead be used to increase salaries on those salary scales recommended by the consultant. The consultants also recommended reducing the usage of annual salary reviews and instead focus on regular moves through the salary scale, including additional steps for hard to fill classifications. With this in mind, as well as the state's structural budget issues, DLS recommends deleting funding for the annual salary review. On page 21, another budget committee request in the JCR last year was to establish the task force on the modernization of the state personnel management system. That group focused on the state's hiring process, which is prescribed primarily in state statute. The task force's report noted that the hiring process can take up to 90 days from job posting to first day of employment, and that even in an ideal scenario, it can sometimes last as long as 63 days. This long window can often lead to the loss of job candidates. Recommendations included encouraging continuous rating of job applicants before job postings close, and creating dedicated staff to take ownership of the hiring process. DLS has asked DBM to comment on efforts to adopt task force recommendations. A couple other personnel policy issues to note at the bottom of page 21. Funds are provided in the dedicated purpose account to allow for the development of apprenticeships in state government. DBM has worked with the Department of Labor to identify candidates for positions that could have apprenticeship paths. The funding would pay apprenticeship costs rather than charging agency budgets. And finally, for this issue, DBM is negotiating a new telework policy for state agencies, which are currently left up to agency discretion, and DLS is just asking DBM to comment on the status of the policy. Beginning here on page 22 and then continuing on to page 23, Exhibit 10 shows some information about the state's health insurance plan. Premiums for most members increased by 5% for the third straight year. Medical costs, as shown in this exhibit, grew by about 5.2% in fiscal 2023 and are projected to increase by that amount in fiscal 2024 and 25. Prescription costs grew by 3.5% in fiscal 2023, but are expected to decline for the state plan by 17% in fiscal 2025 due to the Part D transition. DLS is recommending annual committee narrative regarding reporting on health plan data. And that leads me to the final issue of this analysis, the transition of Medicare eligible retirees to Medicare Part D coverage. Chapter 397 of 2011 originally terminated coverage effective in fiscal 2020. That transition has been delayed by legal action. Chapter 767 of 2019 established reimbursement programs that would cover out-of-pocket costs for retirees enrolled in Part D coverage. The lawsuit delaying implementation of this transition was dismissed in September of 2023. And DBM and the state are proceeding with this transition to Part D coverage for Medicare eligible retirees. On page 25, Exhibit 11 compares some basic information about the state plan and Medicare Part D. Again, I'll note that no changes take effect until January 1st of 2025. Medicare eligible retirees will need to select and enroll in a Part D plan by then. While every individual is different, federal changes to the Part D out-of-pocket maximums in the Inflation Reduction Act go into effect on January 1st of 2025, making the state plan and Part D somewhat comparable as shown in Exhibit 11. The largest difference is in out-of-pocket costs. However, retirees who retired before December 31st of 2019 would be reimbursed for out-of-pocket costs above the amount in the state plan. Communications about the transition were sent to Medicare eligible retirees in mid-January. That information stated that counseling would be provided to Medicare eligible retirees to help with enrollment and the selection process. DBM is in the process of procuring a company that will provide licensed Part D counselors for Medicare eligible retirees. And DBM is also working to determine the procedure for reimbursing eligible retirees, but it would likely be in the form of a health reimbursement account, tax-free funds that would be used to pay for out-of-pocket prescription costs. As I noted earlier, there are significant cost savings associated with this change. DBM estimates that the savings for a half of a fiscal year, fiscal 2025, would be about $50 million. That is net of the additional costs for counseling and HRA administration. The change also results in a significant decrease in the state's other post-employment benefits liabilities, or OPEB liabilities. The OPEB liability at the close of fiscal 2023 was $11.1 billion. The state's actuary estimates that restoring full prescription coverage for Medicare eligible retirees would increase that liability by $8.9 billion. DLS is asking DBM to comment on communications plans around the Part D transition, procurement of a counseling firm and HRA administrator, and the amount of funds to be provided to Medicare eligible retirees in their HRAs. DLS's recommendations begin on page 27. Just to summarize, the first one increases the turnover rate for a new position. Items 2 and 3 are annual committee narrative. Item 4 restricts funds for the additional increment to instead be used for a salary increase for the standard and correctional officer scales. Item 5 would reduce the supplemental pension contribution. Item 6 reduces funding to reflect anticipated vacancies. Item 7 deletes funding for the annual salary review. Items 8 through 10 and 12 are annual reporting language. And item 11 is annual reporting language with a new provision on data consistency. And then finally, our BRFA action, recommended BRFA action to reduce the mandated supplemental retirement contribution from $75 million to $50 million. With that, I conclude my presentation and would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for the analysis. We have a question from Delegate Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the analyst for your presentation. I just had a question on page 20 of the analysis where DLS recommends restricting funding intended for an additional increment for longer tenured employees go instead to an additional, general salary increase for employees on the standard and the correctional officer pay scales. There are a number of state employees covered by collective bargaining that are neither on the standard or the correctional officer pay plans. Some examples are educators at the school for the deaf, teachers who may teach via juvenile services, or physicians that work at state facilities. They are covered by collective bargaining agreements, and those agreements also call for these employees who have been working at least 5 years to receive an additional increment. So is DLS's recommendation that these state workers in separate pay plans also not receive those longevity increments? Would they be eligible for the additional 6%, or would they be left out?
Right, so the recommendation would be that rather than the funding be provided to those with longer tenured service, it would be provided only to those that are on the salary scales with the 2 salary scales that were mentioned, without regard for which collective bargaining unit they're represented by.
But so even if they're not in either of those pots, they're unaffected? Like some are not on the standard or correctional officer.
Right, so they would then not receive.
It's just a clarification.
The additional,
Yeah.
right, yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Are there any other questions from members of the committee for the analyst? Great, thank you very much. This afternoon, we have Secretary of Budget and Management, Secretary Grady.
Good afternoon, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee. My name is Helene Grady. I'm Secretary, Department of Budget and Management. And with me today at the table for the personnel testimony is Mark Nicole, Deputy Secretary, and Christina Kaminsky, our Director of Employee Benefits. First, I want to say that we appreciate the analysis put forward by Mr. Kramer. Additionally, I just want to share before we dive into the personnel analysis and testimony in particular. I just want to share that 1 year into my role as Secretary of DBM, I am extremely grateful for and impressed by the entire team of staff serving the state at DBM. This includes the operating and capital budget teams, the Office of Personnel Services and Benefits, our statewide EEO office, our central collections unit, our audit, finance, and compliance unit, our fleet management unit, and of course, the incredible staff in the Office of Secretary. I would say that the expertise, commitment, work ethic, and sense of service across DBM is truly exceptional. And I hope that the committee and members of the General Assembly feel well served by the staff at DBM. Going on to the personnel analysis and testimony in particular, over the last year, the department, in collaboration with the governor's office and our colleagues across state agencies, has focused intensely on efforts to support the Moore-Miller administration's goal of rebuilding state government, which I know is a goal that many members of the General Assembly share. These efforts reflect an incredible amount of work led by our colleagues at the Office of Personnel Services and Benefits with their agency HR colleagues across state government. In particular, some of the highlights, which Jason spoke to as well, include recruitment and staffing. We appreciate the recognition in the DLS analysis of the significant progress with hiring and reducing vacant positions over the past year, even while increasing the number of PINs. During 2023, the state added more than 1,300 net new employees in the executive branch after losing a net approximately 2,600 in the 2 years prior. The governor's proposed budget includes more than 1,200 new positions and 900 contractual conversions in the executive branch. We negotiated new MOUs for the majority of our representative workforce that reflect just over 5% in COLA and step wage increases for everyone, and another more than 2% step increase by January 2025 for employees with more than 4.5 years of continuous state service. We are also proud of the work done through the task force on modernization of the state personnel management system, which Mr. Kramer also described, as well as the salary study that DLS discussed. In addition, I just want to highlight that to our knowledge, our first statewide culture survey is another key initiative that we're particularly proud of that is actually just come into fruition. In collaboration with the governor's office, DBM launched, like I said, the first ever statewide culture survey. The survey launched on January 22nd, 2024 and ended on February 2nd, 2024. It's intended to be a tool the state uses for generating direct feedback from state employees that will help agency leadership better address challenges across our various workplace cultures and continue to improve on existing strengths. We expect to share the results of the survey and launch the development of action plans in collaboration with agency leadership in the next several weeks. I should just clarify, we call this the statewide culture survey, but it's occurring to me now that it may not include employees of the legislative branch or the judiciary branch. I think it's executive branch only. With that, we are happy to respond to DLS's questions and recommendations. The first area I believe that DLS asked us to comment on has to do with the anti-diabetic prescription drug costs. They said that DBM should comment on the increase in usage of these medications and efforts to limit their impact on costs to the state prescription drug plan. DBM has been closely monitoring the increase in utilization and cost of anti-diabetic drugs, which is largely driven by the emerging role of GLP-1 agonists. These drugs are increasingly used for weight loss and prediabetes management, which is not currently an approved use. In response to the off-label use, the state recently identified approximately 2,000 members who did not meet the criteria for use. These members received notice in November 2023 that their continued use of these drugs would require prior authorization for plan year 2024. This decision is expected to result in annual savings of up to $10 million to the prescription drug plan. Next, I believe DLS asked us to comment on the task force to modernize the state personnel management system and our efforts to adopt the task force recommendations and whether we are recommending any legislation be adopted to enact any reforms. While the task force felt the requirements in statute likely did contribute to hiring times, the task force believed the time to hire could be improved within the existing framework. As a result, the task force made recommendations that did not require legislative changes, including recommendations to establish best practices for hiring process timelines, increase communication with applicants throughout the process, expand use of open and continuous job postings, and update job titles to make job postings more attractive and understandable. The task force did acknowledge that further review of statutory requirements that govern the state's hiring process should be pursued in the future. Additionally, I would say that DBM has begun work on a number of next steps and looks forward to hiring the state's next executive director of the Office of Personnel Services and Benefits, who will be charged with leading our efforts to implement many of the other recommendations. When it comes to the specific recommendations DLS made in their analysis, I can say that recommendations 1, 2, and 3 DBM concurs with. Recommendation 4, DLS recommended adding language to the budget restricting funding in the statewide program, $45.9 million, that is intended for an additional increment for longer tenured employees to instead be provided as an additional salary increase for employees on the standard and correctional officer pay scales. DBM opposes the restriction of these funds. The state negotiated this increase with the representatives of the bargaining units during the recently completed negotiations. The new MOUs containing this provision have been ratified by the unions with whom the state negotiated this additional increment, and DBM feels strongly that this provision should not be modified. This adjustment for longer tenured employees is intended to help address pay equity and competitiveness issues that occurred as the result of several years without increments for these employees over the last decade. And this is a particularly important element of our efforts to enhance retention. DBM concurs with recommendation number 5. Recommendation number 6, DLS recommends reducing funding for salary actions in the statewide program by $40 million to reflect likely vacancy savings and a budgeted turnover rate of 8.6%. DBM respectfully disagrees with this recommendation. DBM believes that this recommendation would have an unintended consequence of slowing agencies' hiring efforts because of uncertainty about how much funding is available to them from the statewide salary account to support their salary expenses. We appreciate DLS's recognition in the analysis of the significant progress the administration has made in hiring and retention during the last year, reducing the vacancy rate from 13.1% to 10.4%, even while increasing PINs. The budget as submitted reflects an overall vacancy rate of 7.8%, which assumes we continue at about the same level of improvement in hiring over the next year that we've experienced over the past year. We have no reason to believe this momentum will not continue. DBM respectfully requests that we retain the funding to continue the administration's and General Assembly's collective focus on rebuilding state government. Recommendation number 7, DLS recommends deleting funding for the annual salary review. DBM opposes this recommendation. While DBM supports the recommendation from the salary study to reduce the reliance going forward on ASRs, we would note that these increases were negotiated with the representatives of the bargaining units during the recently completed negotiations, and DBM feels strongly that these agreed upon terms should not be modified. As part of the recent MOU negotiations, the administration has committed to launching a statewide labor management committee, including representatives from AFSCME, MPEC, and AFT Healthcare, as a next step to the salary study to explore modifications to the state standard and correctional salary schedules, pay equity, and salary compression, and make recommendations to the Secretary of DBM by August 2024. One goal is for those recommendations to support our movement away from reliance on ASRs going forward while we focus on improving the overall salary scales. I can say that for recommendations 8 through 12 and the additional BRFA item, DBM concurs with the DLS recommendations. Happy to answer questions.
Delegate Solomon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Secretary, it's good to see you. I just had a couple of quick questions around the personnel work group report. And it's been nice to work with your staff on implementing some of those recommendations. Can you tell us a little bit about where you are in the process of hiring the new director and when we might see that person?
Sure. Actually, I did some phone screens this morning and earlier this week as well. So that the recruitment is active and open. It is posted continuously until we make a hire. It's been posted, I believe, since mid to late December. We do have a solid applicant pool. There's a number of applicants and very qualified applicants. I'm actually pretty excited about the pool and hoping, as I've told some of the applicants, to launch first round interviews in the next 2 to 3 weeks is my goal, but with the caveat that we're also in the middle of session and trying to negotiate a tough budget. So if it slips a bit, it could go into early April. My absolute goal is to onboard a new executive director, certainly later this spring.
Okay, great. Yeah, you have a couple of things going on. And then just sort of following up on that. So I know there's $2 million in the dedicated purpose account to implement some of the changes that were recommended in that report. Can you talk about it? I know some of this is going to be dependent on who the new director is. Can you talk a little bit about what your sense is some of that money will go towards?
Sure. And I think you said 2 million. We actually proposed 3. Maybe you've already cut it to 2. I'm not sure.
No, there was nothing Freudian there. That's what I thought I had read in the analysis.
Okay.
So
we proposed 3 for this DPA purpose, rebuilding government year 2. We're proposing to build on the momentum from year 1 in fiscal 24, where we supported efforts by Governor's Office and DBM leadership around rebuilding government and some of the things I already talked about. The focus for use of the funding for the remainder of fiscal 24 and fiscal 25 would be across multiple areas, including first, enhancing diversity, equity, and inclusion within the state workforce. Our year 1 rebuilding government effort was largely focused on recruitment, retention, filling seats, and in particular, after reviewing with Nicole Webb, our statewide EEO director, the data in the most recent statewide staff composition report, which comes out at the end of each year, it's incumbent on me to try to direct some of this funding and effort in year 2 towards enhancing diversity, equity, inclusion at all levels of our state workforce. And so I am hoping to engage with the new director around some initiatives and potential use of this funding in that regard. Also developing and implementing action plans to strengthen workplace culture based on the results of the culture survey. So we're getting ready to roll out these results. We're going to be asking agency heads and their leadership teams to develop action plans. I do anticipate we may need some funding to either consulting support or other efforts around those action plans. Next, we are certainly looking to support this labor management committee that I described, focused on competitiveness of pay salaries and pay equity, with any additional analysis that might be required to get that work done. So that's a potential proposed use for some of these funds. And then a couple last things too. One would be developing a plan to enhance recruitment and retention, building on the work of the task force in terms of an actual action plan and next steps. And then last, some development of planning around professional development and training. So that has come out, particularly with regard to our retention efforts, as a real, I think, weakness within the executive branch and SPMS with regard to professional development and training. We really do not have a function under DBM or OPSB that that leads those efforts for the state. And I'd like to begin to build that out. We may need to use some of this funding to help develop those plans, again, potentially with assistance from a consultant or others.
Great. And then I just have one last
That's
question.
a lot for 3 million. I don't know if we'll get it all accomplished. But.
Well, the one last question, just to build off your comment about recruitment. And I know we've talked about this, and that was a lot of the recommendation of the report. Do you anticipate, in absence of sort of the full recruitment strategy that I know the new director is going to push on, having DBM resources really help the agencies that are struggling? The work to hire has been just clearly yeoman's work has been done over the last year to bring down the vacancy rate, but we still have some agencies, DJS in particular, there's certain agencies that still have double-digit vacancy rates. And is there a thought to have DBM sort of step in a little bit and help provide them assistance, give them extra, maybe some extra HR help to help with that recruitment?
Potentially. I think DBM and our recruitment division within OPSB has been pretty hands-on over the last year already with all of our agencies and helping where we can, but certainly some agencies probably could use supplemental help. I think in terms of targeting some of the use of these funds toward the task force recommendations, one of my top priorities is really to develop a plan for how to build out the systems and automation tools to help automate that process along the lines of what the task force was recommending. So particularly in terms of more cross-agency recruitment pools for key classifications where we're always hiring. And I understand that there's some technology challenges to the way we do that today. And so that's a key thing. And I think that, the benefits of that would certainly flow through to the agencies that are most challenged as well. To the extent we can automate more of that work, that's one of the top priorities for me in this next year.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Butch, are there any other questions? Delegate Price?
Mr. Chairman, when you say enhancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, does that mean hiring to reflect the demographics of our state?
That's one aspect of it. I think if you take a look at the annual EEO report, you do see pretty clearly in the data that, first of all, the report does use data around the composition of the statewide labor pool to compare to state government and where we have disparities. And in particular, you see those disparities at certain levels of state government, particularly the higher levels, executive managerial roles, as opposed to some of the more entry-level roles. And so when I speak to it, I'm talking about, trying to enhance that representation across all those levels, if that makes sense.
It does. Is there any way that you could share with us that data?
Sure.
With our, our personnel and
absolutely. We sent the annual report over in January. It's on our website, and we're happy to forward it. Happy to forward it again to the committee.
All right, thank you.
Chair, and thank you for being here today. On the transition for the retiree prescription drugs, the counseling services, I know you put out an emergency RFP to get that vendor in place. Do you have any idea what the timeline is and when you expect to bring them on board?
Thanks for asking. It's actually an expedited procurement as opposed to an emergency. And I understand there is a difference in our procurement law. And I believe this is might be state procurement's first time using the expedited procurement process. Christina Kaminsky is here with us and she's really leading that RFP effort. And I would ask her to respond to the timeline. It is on the street now, but I can't remember the dates in terms of the deadlines.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So for the question, it is an expedited procurement. It is the first use of an expedited procurement. We are working diligently. It is on the streets. We will hold our pre-proposal conference in this coming week. We hope to be able to make the award towards the end of April and have contract in place by June 1.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Are there any other questions from members of the committee for the secretary? Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This afternoon, we have joining us several witnesses. We'll call them up, and then if each witness could provide a 2-minute testimony, that'd be great. Patrick Moran with AFSCME, Todd Reynolds with AFT Maryland, Rose Wirtz with AFT Healthcare Maryland, Alicia Hawkins with the Maryland Professional Employees Council, AFT Local 6197. And Peter Rickus. And James Roberts. Okay, we could start on this end, just work your way down, 2 minutes each. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go first. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee. My name is Todd Reynolds. I'm the political coordinator for the American Federation of Teachers in Maryland. We are the state federation for a number of state employee unions in the state, including AFT Healthcare, representing state employees in Unit E, Maryland Professional Employees Council, MPEC, representing professional employees, state employees in Unit G, as well as the Maryland School for the Deaf, which is state employees in Unit K. We're here to testify in support of this provision of the budget, asking to fully fund our collective bargaining agreements, but also to resist or in opposition to the DLS recommendations to do away with what we're terming the longevity step, and to get rid of the or opposing the proposal to get rid of annual salary reviews. We submitted written testimony, so just really briefly, I know you want to get started on your weekend. Essentially, last year, our 3 unions engaged with the Moore Miller administration on a collective bargaining agreement that will last 3 years. We came to an agreement. It was a lot of give and take, a lot of understanding the other side's positions. We landed on an agreement, which we're all very proud of. All 3 of our unions have ratified very recently. This is ready to go into effect. Key provisions within those agreements are additional steps for long-standing state employees for 5 years or more. It was a big priority for a number of our unions. Many of our state employees who've been working for 15 years are 8-9 steps behind. And then MPEC especially wanted to register the concern that part of their contract is annual salary reviews, and they wanted to keep that in the contract as well. So we're asking that the legislation respect our agreement, our contracts with the state, and fully fund our contracts. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman and members of the Appropriations Committee. I'm Rosemary Wirtz, Field Coordinator for AFT Healthcare Maryland, the exclusive bargaining representative for healthcare professionals in Maryland state government. Thank you for the opportunity to submit testimony in support of budget item F10A02, the personnel budget submission from the Department of Budget Management. We would like to take this opportunity to address our concerns with recommendations from DLS. We support funding for the longevity step and the annual salary review upgrades negotiated in our memorandum of understanding. We negotiated upgrades for a few of our classifications assigned to our bargaining unit this year with a minimal cost to the state. But this was not our year for ASRs. We had a big ASR list last year. This kind of seems to be cyclical. While the cost of our annual salary review upgrades are not vast this year, other bargaining units are trying to catch up. We had a big one last year. So it is important to allow for the other bargaining. When we move up, they move up behind. So it's like I said, it's cyclical. We do not disagree with the LS recommendation to consistently fund increments. However, we do not agree with limiting salary actions to step adjustments is practical for our bargaining unit. You can't deal with the salary inequities made over the last 15 years through step adjustments only. So we believe that is a problem. We firmly believe that the failure to fund increments in the past has led to issues of salary compression that the negotiated longevity step was negotiated to address. AFT Healthcare Maryland asks for your support for negotiation process and urges the committee to fund the ASRs and the longevity step by adopting the budget as submitted by the Department of Budget Management. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Patrick. Includes additional positions and our negotiated raises. We urge the committee to reject the DLS recommendations to cut our employee raises and reallocate them because, as their study states, they are still woefully behind. We are committed to working with the DBM to address fixes to the standard and correctional pay scales during the interim and don't want a setback in these efforts. Our members are still working short staff, dangerously sometimes in places like corrections, MDH, and DJS. And caseloads are still high in places like parole and probation and the Office of the Public Defender. Also, Marylanders are on long waiting lists to get the state services they need and deserve. We are happy to participate with the SPMS modernization work group and believe these recommendations should be funded and implemented before we undo decades worth of state merit hiring law. Additionally, we'd also like to work on looking at ways to improve the state pension because it serves as an important motivator for employees to take public jobs and stay at them. When the state increased the vesting time to 10 years, our union noticed the negative impact it had on 5-year retention rates. During the Great Recession, a number of careless cuts were made, including the retiree prescription drug plan, that is unfortunately coming to fruition this year. And the budget was balanced off the backs of state employees. We opposed those cuts then, and we oppose them now. As we look to cut the structural deficit, we should not repeat the same mistakes as employees are still recovering from those cuts. Thank you for your continued support of all of Maryland state employees. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Peter Richkus, and my comments are directed towards the planned ending of prescription drug coverage for retirees. Based on our investigation, viable options do exist to both enhance the state's standing with rating agencies and continue retirees' promised prescription coverage. On the first page of my written transcript, there's a pie chart that will suggest to you the small role played by Medicare eligible retirees' prescription drug plan. This small sliver of the pie of healthcare benefits included in OPEB is not what is going to make a difference to the bond rating agency. In fact, rating agencies have never downgraded a state solely based on unfunded OPEB liability. The greater threat to Maryland's bond rating is found in the latest rating agency reports, and that is weaknesses within the state's pension trust funding. The OPEB trust fund is mentioned by the rating agencies, but it's the state's failure to fund the trust that has drawn attention. The recent $25 million contribution to it, while modest, will register positively with the rating agencies. Best practices, including from the state's actuary, as well as pointed out by DLS, note that funding an OPEB trust actually enhance credit ratings. 75% of state retirees, including most of the 55,000 plus and more retirees impacted by this proposed change, spend more than $3.5 billion in their pension payments, and vote in your districts. State retirees ask the General Assembly, with this committee's leadership and the governor's support, to address Maryland's financial stability concerns and honor the promises made to retirees hired before July 1, 2011. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee. My name is James Roberts. I retired after 33 years of service to the state. The state is concerned about its AAA bond rating, that it will be harmed by the OPEB liability. But OPEB liability has been decreasing dramatically over the last 4 years, and the Medicare eligible prescription plan has only added 1% per year to that OPEB liability for the last 4 years. As Ms. Richkus mentioned, pre-funding the OPEB trust would have saved $6 billion over in OPEB liability over the last 5 years, and over $110 million in costs by the state. The other issue is that Medicare Part D is not equivalent to the state prescription plan. There's been a lot of talk thinking that it is, but it is not. The state formulary, that is the list of drugs that is covered, is much more extensive than the Part D formulary. Retirees must pay the full price of drugs that are not on their formulary. These drugs are also not included in the caps, the $2,000 or the $1,500 caps that have been discussed in terms of out-of-pocket expenses. If your drug is not covered, you get no benefit. The provisions of Chapter 767 in 2019 do not apply to drugs that are not covered by the Part D formulary. And none of these provisions, including the health reimbursement account that is being suggested now, are available to people who retired after January 1, 2020. That also includes roughly 32,000 current employees hired before July 1, 2011, according to the fiscal and policy notes. So what I would like to ask is that I propose that you delay the implementation of this action so that a study can be performed to find out answers to these key questions. So far, DBM and DLS has not told you how much, they have told you how much OPEB liability has increased or would increase if the program continued, but they haven't told you how much it would decrease if you discontinue the program. So I'd ask you that you consider a delay, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for the panel. Delegate McComas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm rather new to this issue, but I wanted to know, has there been any mediation or discussions that, you know, we have a problem here? You guys aren't getting younger, so we don't expect you to work at the local grocery store bagging groceries or checking groceries. And, you know, there's mobility issues. And so the question is that a lot of you, I would assume, worked for the state government, because you got good retirement benefits at the time. So you would take a little less salary, or maybe a lot less salary from the state of Maryland versus, you know, going out and you know, being Bill Gates or something and forming a multi-million-dollar company. So my question is, I assume you guys are very knowledgeable about this and the ups and downs and the litigation, but has the group, you know, folks from DBM and folks from your side of the table gotten together and said, okay, this is a problem. What can we do to fix it and at least moderate some of the pain that you guys are saying the prescription D of Medicare doesn't take care of?
The simple answer is no, we have not gotten together in such a way. And you are right. We have many of us took jobs with lower pay, knowing that we were getting good benefits, or expecting that we were getting good benefits, I should say. And we were promised good benefits. Those benefits are now being taken away. We also, not only did we take lower salaries, but we have suffered, as other members of this panel have mentioned, over the years with furloughs, with the lack of increases, et cetera. But that is a reason that I'm proposing at least, that we take a minute and take a look at this. You'll note that if you go back to the record, that Senator McKay, who's offered the bill, the similar bill in the Senate, actually, at the time he offered it to the committee, said that he would amend it to do exactly the same thing, to take a year or so and take a look, do a study, and find out the answers to the problems, and have a chance to have a dialogue.
Great minds think alike. No, just kidding. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, are there any other questions from members of the committee for the panel? Great, thank you very much. Just to verify, Felicia Hawkins, okay, great, thank you very much. Okay, that ends the hearing for Department of Budget Management and Personnel. We will now move on to the Department of Budget Management Secretary, and our budget analyst is Jacob Cash. We don't have you signed up. Yeah, the committee does have your written testimony. You're Ms. Kathleen Miller. We have your written testimony right here. Well, the rules are, you have to sign up appropriately and then. Okay, sure. Come on up, Ms. Miller. Thank you, Delegate Forbes. Okay, go ahead. 2 minutes.
My name is Kathleen Miller. Legislators say most retirees should experience little, if any, changes in out-of-pocket prescription drug costs. It's not true. Retirees will have huge increases in drug costs, and the state will pay high medical bills when retirees stop taking medication and end up in the emergency room. Some will die. Drugs are cheaper. The state plan is part Medicare D, part state funded with a robust formulary or drug list. In contrast, each Medicare Part D plan drug list is unique. Retirees must enter their prescription drugs when choosing a plan. When taking multiple drugs, the chance of having drugs not covered increases. Most Part D plans limit their drug list, even expensive plans. Canceling the state plan is going to hurt those who take multiple drugs. That may not be the intent, but is the result. Only covered drugs included in your Part D plan count toward out-of-pocket cost for the $2,000 cap that's supposed to fix everything. All you need is one expensive uncovered drug and you're doomed. My husband had cancer and needed chemotherapy. Suddenly he had a blood clot and was prescribed a blood thinner, which the state plan covers for a $50 copay for 90 days. But Part D charges coinsurance, 20 to 50% of the covered drug cost. On Part D, it would cost $400 to $1,000 every 90 days. Part D will cause a huge increase for covered drugs. Then, had the drug not been covered, he would have had to pay $2,000 for 90 days. He needed this drug. Last year, drugs on the state plan cost us $800 plus. Next year with Part D, it's $4,700 plus. That's $1,200 more for covered drugs and $2,700 more for uncovered drugs. To say there is a $2,000 cap when someone has to pay $4,700, that's with the cap. Part D is not comparable. The state claims they can't afford it. Fixed income retirees can't afford this huge expense either. I oppose removing retirees from the state prescription plan. Please delay and reconsider. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, man. Just out of curiosity, what department or what agency did you work for the state
UMBC,
and how many years?
20.
20. And what, can I ask what type of drug it is that your husband had to take?
He takes a drug for peripheral neuropathy. The drug that was covered was Eliquis, the blood thinner.
Eliquis.
But the drug that is not covered is a drug for peripheral neuropathy, it's Metonix.
Methodex. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other?
Department of Budget and Management Secretary Office, Jacob Cash. Jacob.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, my name is Jacob Cash. I'm a policy analyst for the Department of Legislative Services, and today I'll be presenting the fiscal 2025 operating budget for the Department of Budget and Management, Office of the Secretary. This unit includes the primary budgetary control units for the executive branch, including operating budget, capital budget, financial management, and collections on debts owed to the state. If you join me on the cover page, you can see that the fiscal 2025 budget allowance is $40.4 million, which represents a 1.7% decline from fiscal 2024 levels. Beginning with the performance evaluation of CCU, Exhibit 1 on page 5 shows CCU revenues versus expenses over the past decade. While there was a slight decline in collections and expenses, net profit was generated in fiscal 2023, and that is shown in Exhibit 2 on page 6. CCU was able to ensure that profit by collecting a higher percentage of debts owed to the state this year. There has also been an increase in Easy Pass referrals for debt collection that were allowed to resume in December 2022, and DLS is asking the agency to comment on that resumption of collection activities and any backlog that might have created. The second performance evaluation is for the state vehicle fleet goal of ensuring at least 25% of new vehicles purchased by state agencies are zero emission vehicles, or ZEVs. As shown in Exhibit 3 on page 8, the state did not meet this goal in fiscal 2023, only purchasing 14 ZEVs and reaching 16% of total purchases for which an option was available. One major obstacle to expanding ZEVs is the lack of diversity in customization options to meet the specialized needs of agency vehicle fleets, as well as insufficient size options and lack of convenient charging infrastructure. Exhibit 4 on page 10 shows the current $40.4 million budget broken down by unit. CCU is the largest budgetary unit, and they're self-funded by the fees they assess on collections. Of the remaining units, the Office of Budget Analysis requires the most resources, followed by the executive direction for the agency. Exhibit 5 on page 11 breaks down the budget by item, and personnel costs make up more than half of this budget, which is highly administrative. IT services are the second largest budget item, particularly for the IT services that support the statewide budget system and debt collection systems, as well as IT services provided by the Department of Information Technology and external contractors. Exhibit 6 on page 12 breaks down the proposed budget change of $693,000 by item. The main source of the budget decline is a $702,000 reduction in IT development costs for the new fleet management system that has been removed from this budget to be upgraded to a major IT development project, as well as a $594,000 reduction in rent related to CCU moving from State Center. And the first year of their costs for their new location will be waived as part of the rental agreement. So there's a reduction this year, but we're expecting that to be increased in the following budget. Other sources of the budget decline were related to reduced maintenance costs for the statewide budget system, lower costs for their new communications vendor, as well as IT and shared services reductions. Those reductions were balanced out by increases in personnel for salaries and fringe benefits, as well as the conversion of 6 full-time contractual positions into full-time regular positions. And those are funded by CCU, so special funds. The first issue I'd like to talk about today is the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA funding, that the state has remaining. These expenditures and remaining funds are listed in Exhibit 7 on page 16. And they're listed by policy area. Appendix R in the fiscal 2025 budget highlights published by DBM showed that approximately $3.15 billion was expended from ARPA from fiscal 2021 to 2023 from the state and local fiscal relief fund. And there remains approximately $557.7 million, or 18% of that total allotment. States are required by the grant conditions to encumber the funds by December 31st, 2024, and expend them by December 31st, 2026. Exhibit 8 on page 19 summarizes the remaining funds by policy area. The $557.7 million is split between many areas, with broadband expansion being the largest at $190.5 million, or about 84% of that allotment left, particularly for network infrastructure. Public health has the second largest pot of funding remaining due to the Healthy Schools / HVAC allotment, which has gone completely unspent as of yet at $80 million. The supplemental instruction / tutoring program for K-12 education also has a large balance of $63.6 million, or 42% of that allotment. DBM has reported that at least 2 of their regular employees and 1 contractual employee dedicate at least some of their time to reviewing and managing federal funds, including ARPA. And they also have a contract, the state has a contract with Hagerty Consulting that DBM uses to provide coordination, technical assistance, subrecipient monitoring, as well as other federal funding oversight requirements, such as data collection and reporting. That vendor has at least 1 project manager that is dedicated to ARPA funding, as well as variable consultant time. Because the allotted or the allocated grant funding will expire if not encumbered by the end of the calendar year, DLS is asking DBM to brief the committees on their plans to reallocate any unspent funds and DLS recommends the adoption of budget bill language restricting funds pending a report that outlines their previous, current, and future ARPA oversight activities. The second issue I'd like to address is the need for MFR measures for the expanded audit and finance compliance unit. This issue begins on page 20. The unit is now larger than their Division of Finance and Administration, which is responsible for internal DBM payroll, purchasing, and budgeting. So this is now a substantial unit of the department with 10 regular positions, only 1 of which was vacant at the start of the year. So they've made really good progress in filling out this unit. And now that they are engaging in regular activities, we'd like to see some managing for results measures be reported. The budget for this unit totals $1.9 million. And while DLS recognizes that there is need to have this technical assistance be provided to state agencies, and Exhibit 9 on page 21, as well as Exhibit 10 on page 22, summarizes some of those issues the state is seeing in repeat audit findings. But related to this issue, DLS recommends new goals, objectives, and measures be developed for the next budget cycle. The third issue I'll be addressing today is the potential underfunding of mandates and entitlements in state agency budgets. This issue begins on page 22. Individual DLS analyses for Medicaid, foster care, and debt services projected shortfalls totaling $290 million, as shown in Exhibit 11 on page 23. While there was a surplus of $46 million in the Behavioral Health Administration and other general fund savings of $29 million for Medicaid, the state is likely to see shortfalls if additional funding is not provided. DLS recommends authorizing the transfer from the Rainy Day Fund of $65 million in fiscal 2024 and $100 million in fiscal 2025 to cover Medicaid shortfalls, as well as $34 million in fiscal 2025 to cover foster care shortfalls. If the maximum transfers are made, this action would reduce the balance in the Rainy Day Fund to $2.1 billion, or about 8.6% of general fund revenues. DLS is also asking DBM to comment on the projected shortfalls and describe the agency's proposed strategy for addressing those underfunding. Finally, the fourth issue today is the monitoring of competitive grants with a state match requirement. Language added to the fiscal 2024 budget required DBM to submit quarterly reports summarizing the status of all competitive grants, and it required that state agencies applying for IIJA or IRA grant funding provide notification to the budget committees at least 10 days before they submit that application. However, according to DBM, while 34 applications were submitted in fiscal 2024, only 2 of those submitted notification to the budget committees. Those 2 applications are still pending, along with 14 other pending applications, but some of them were already awarded. The 34 applications in total are associated with state matches totaling $553.3 million. And while it's not clear when these were submitted, this is still concerning that they did not provide notification to the budget committees. DLS is recommending to repeat this quarterly reporting language and notification language, as well as include the request that the date the application was submitted be included. To illustrate the issue that some of the state match budgeting, to illustrate some of the issues that can come up by not budgeting properly for a state match, Exhibit 12 on page 25 shows 4 scenarios, and 2 of these were non-compliant scenarios that were reported by DBM in those quarterly reports, and the first 2 scenarios are compliant ones that DLS developed. The non-compliant scenarios 3 and 4 would not satisfy the matching requirements because 80% of costs, or because the grant is limited to 80% of costs being covered by federal funds. At least 20% must be by state funds and 20% can be provided from other federal sources, while only 60% can come from this grant in question. So as you can see in scenarios 3 and 4, not enough of the funding would come from the state if they were to be granted that amount. And if the grant amount was reduced, as indicated by the second quarterly report, the state match would still not be sufficient. So in scenario 1 and 2, they were adjusted. In scenario 1, we assume that the federal grant is received. And in scenario 2, we assume that there is no other federal grant money that is received. In scenario 2, that grant award would be reduced so that 60% is met. The project would be fully funded in that first scenario if we receive the other federal funding, but if we don't receive that other federal funding, the project is only funded halfway. So actually anticipating that a state match is needed and being able to incorporate that into the budget is a large part of actually ensuring these grant funds are used the proper way. Related to this issue, DLS suggests that DBM should work with their agencies in future grant application reports so that the relevant budgetary decision makers are aware of potential commitments. The recommended actions for this budget begin on page 27 and continue through page 41. They're summarized for convenience on page 2 and 3. I'll point out that recommended actions 1, 2, 3, and 7 are all new, while recommended actions 4, 5, 6, and 8 through 15 are annual recommendations to manage the budget process. Finally, recommended action 16 is related to those competitive grant applications that I just mentioned. There are 6 appendices at the end of the document that list summaries for JCR reports submitted in the past year, audit findings for the central collection unit and statewide budget systems, as well as major IT projects for a new capital budget system and a new vehicle fleet management system. But that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cash, for a great analysis. Any questions for our analysts? Okay, Grady, welcome back.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Helene Grady, Secretary of Budget and Management, here with Mark Nicole, Deputy Secretary. We appreciate the thorough analysis put forward by Mr. Cash. We're happy to respond to DLS's questions and recommendations, and many of our leadership team are present as well who can help respond to questions on particular topics. Starting off with, I think the first item that DLS asked us to comment on has to do with the Easy Pass debt collection activities. DLS said the DBM Central Collection Unit should comment on the resumption of Easy Pass debt collection activities and any backlog of such cases. We can report that Easy Pass placed approximately 2 million toll violation debts with CCU between July 11, 2023 and November 14, 2023. The total value of those placements is $63.5 million. It's our understanding that this inventory represents a fraction of the delinquent toll violation debts eligible for placement with CCU. While working through these placements, we are also working with MDTA to resume placements on additional delinquent inventory in the future. Next, DLS asked DBM to brief the committee on any plans to reallocate unspent funds from ARPA to other purposes. We're happy to provide this update on state's ARPA spending. As of December 31st, 2023, the state has spent $3.24 billion, or 87% of the $3.72 billion award. State spending increased by almost $100 million since the end of fiscal 2023. Progress in spending has been made across all state agencies with significant increases in broadband and education programs in particular. DBM meets quarterly with those agencies with sizable unspent balances to check on the progress of spending. Adjustments have been made to reallocate funding in cases where projects have finished or it appears that an agency will not be able to spend their entire allocation. DBM would also like to report that the state has obligated just about 95% of its award as of December 31st, 2023. As noted in the analysis, this is particularly important as all states are required to have 100% of awards obligated by the end of calendar 24. To make sure that the state meets this deadline, DBM will be meeting with every agency with unobligated funds over the next month. That will be Mr. Nickel. The purpose of these meetings is to work with agencies to develop plans to ensure all funds are obligated in a timely fashion or to reallocate funds to programs where the funding can be spent. Any funding that is reallocated will be processed via budget amendment, providing the General Assembly an opportunity to review the new spending plan. DLS asked us to comment on the projected underfunding of entitlements and mandates in the governor's allowance and describe the agency's proposed strategy to address the projected underfunding. DBM agrees with the projected shortfall estimated by DLS for the Medicaid program in fiscal 24 and 25. Subject to revenue estimates, which will be coming from the Board of Revenue Estimates next week, DBM is considering proposing supplemental budget funding to help cover the shortfall. DBM respectfully disagrees with the projected shortfall for foster care. We believe those costs are budgeted appropriately in the governor's allowance. When it comes to the other recommendations, I can say that DBM concurs with recommendation number 1. On recommendation number 2, DBM also concurs. This relates to developing MFR goals, objectives, and measures for the Audit and Financial Compliance Unit. We do concur with the recommendation, although we do want to note that MFR measures will relate specifically to the job duties and function of our unit, not the outcomes of repeat audit findings statewide. The DBM unit offers support and consultation, but does not have authority or direct responsibility for addressing repeat audit findings in other state agencies. Recommendations 3 and 4, DBM concurs. Recommendation 5, DLS recommends amending section 2 to limit appropriations that can be placed into contingency reserve to items restricted by the General Assembly. DBM does not concur with this proposed limitation on the Secretary's authority to manage the budget and would ask the committees to accept the language in this section in the budget as introduced. In addition, to simplify our administrative processes, DBM suggests that beginning with the fiscal 25 budget, the budget committees notify the comptroller directly rather than routing notification through DBM regarding approval of the release of funds restricted by the General Assembly. DBM will continue to monitor the release of funds and produce the list of withheld allotments, Exhibit D in the Fiscal Digest. Recommendation number 6, DLS recommends amending section 17 to disallow transfers to other purposes and make it possible for the OLA to track the disposition of funds in restricted statewide sub-objects. DBM does not concur with the recommendation to disallow transfers from restricted objects of expenditure to other purposes, as in very limited circumstances, this can be a useful budget management tool. The language permitting the Secretary of Budget and Management to approve the transfer of funds from various statewide allocations for other purposes had been included in annual budget bills for several years prior to fiscal 2016. Given that DBM respectfully requests the committees reject the analyst recommendation and allow the new administration to resume this authority. I can say that for recommendations number 7 through 16. DBM concurs.
Response via analysis. Secretary Grady or her team? Have a great weekend.
Great,
You-
thank you.
you too.
You too.
Committee, have a great weekend. We're adjourned.